In this video, I'd like to explain to you the development of the American comic, and I know we're talking about almost 150 years, but I'm going to try and condense it into a couple of minutes. So if we look at the influences of the American comic, we need to really start in the early 1900s, when entertainment for the masses was really radio and newspaper. And newspapers, on any given Sunday, there would be the Sunday comic supplement that would come out, and that was the entertainment that people had, and they looked forward to it. Also, another important thing to remember is that technology has played an important part in the development of the comic. And if we go back to the 1900s, to the American Sunday comic section, we have Hogan's Alley. So this is a gang of young kids who are roaming the streets of New York, getting up to mischief, and they have a little bald boy in a yellow nightgown, and he is the little yellow kid, and he has introduced color for the first time into the Sunday American comics. What progressed from there, from the 1900s, is, let's shoot through to, say, the late 1920s, early 1930s, and what publishers did is they took the comic strips of the Sunday American papers and they created small books, little comic books, and that became the advent of the comic book, and they were reprints of the Sunday news. They then realized that there was an opportunity to make money off selling the comic books, and new content, new material was created, and so the comic industry came about, where you had an author, a publisher, illustrator, inker, colorist. Let's jump now to 1930, and we now introduce the concept of the superhero. And who's the most famous superhero that we know? Superman. Superman is the epitome, the icon of American comics. So Action Comics 1 is the first comic, the comic book itself for Superman. Prior to that, Superman actually was a daily comic strip. And just if I can explain what we mean by a daily comic strip, the daily comic strip would run from a Monday to Saturday, and then on Sunday, as I mentioned, the Sunday comic supplement would essentially have a full page for that character. So 1930, we see the advent of the superhero, and of course that led to the catastrophic events of the Second World War, and the superheroes played their role in bringing down Adolf Hitler and the Axis forces. Then we skip post 1945, and really 1950 was a bleak time for the American comic industry, because in the McCarthy era you basically had people being hunted down for being communists, and the comic industry was not excluded from that. What you basically found is that the comic industry had to essentially self-regulate itself, and that brought about the Comic Code Authority. So prior to that, you had the likes of William E. Gaines, who had a publishing comic business. His father started it, which was called Education Comics, but then he converted it. The son, William E. Gaines, converted that to e-comics, entertainment comics, and the content in the sort of late 40s, early 50s was quite graphic, horror depicting severed heads, limbs, and what the American public believed is that adult children delinquency was being brought about because the kids were reading these comics. Of course, we know today that that is not true, but that changed literally when the McCarthy era and the government said these are bad for the youth of America. The industry went through a huge shake-up, and people overnight lost their businesses, livelihood, and had to reinvent themselves. So the comics of the post-50s were a lot more watered down, less adult content, and you had the likes of Archie, the Harvey comics, and they were more for young children, but there was no real adult content. We jumped to the 1960s, the introduction of Marvel, and Marvel Comics, Stan Lee has now introduced a range of superheroes together with the king of comics, as we know, Jack Kirby, and we have the Fantastic Four, we have Spider-Man, we have Thor, and what we find with Spider-Man, for example, is that the reader can now identify with the superhero because Peter Parker, being Spider-Man, has insecurities, he's a teenager, he lacks confidence, and so the reader can identify with that person. Whereas Superman, he was beyond our reach, he was larger than life. So that is Marvel. DC were also around at that stage, and we call that stage the Silver Age of comics. Let's jump now to 1980, and what we have is the advent of the graphic novel. And what I'll do in some of my other videos is I'll talk more about Art Spiegelman, who is the only artist, cartoonist to have actually won a Pulitzer Prize for his graphic novel. And we'll also talk a little bit more about Frank Miller and how he totally transformed Batman into, as we know, the Dark Knight. So that is 1980s. We're currently 2015. And what we've seen is that in the last 150 years, comics have evolved, developed, and the reader has grown with the comics, and therefore there are people like myself in their 50s who have read comics for the last 35, 40 years, and we, of course, our palates change and we want to read more adult content as well. So I hope that was informative and you got a little bit more of a snapshot of the American comic. And please subscribe to my channel, and remember, we're about cracking the code.